Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. Sometimes you play a game of chess and something weird happens. In this game, my opponent and I started trading pieces in the mid-game, and we were balanced and largely symmetrical. And then it became apparent that neither of us had lost any pawns. It felt almost like an unspoken thing between the two of us in this rapid 10-minute game, but we ended up not giving up or taking any pawns until all pieces other than the king were off the board. Let's have a look at this odd game where we entered the endgame with a king and our full complement of pawns. So let's have a quick look at the game. So review first. You can see it's very, very equal initially, and then we've got these wild fluctuations between losing, winning, and draws, and that relates to that funny pawn endgame. So on to analysis. So in this game, I played oops, there we go. So in this game, I played black, opponent white, and we started with an Italian, so the Guaco piano game. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight c6, develop knight to c4. I developed my knight to c5. So very normal looking Guaco piano. There we go. And now the opponent develops their bishop to g5, attacking my knight. I ask the question with f6, what are they going to do with the bishop? They capture the knight, capture back with the queen, develop the other knight. I move my knight forward, inviting a trade in knights, and I take back with the bishop. They advance with the knight to d5. Because I didn't want to lose that pawn, I opted to bring the queen all the way back. I move my bishop back here, potentially inviting a trade. They opted not to do that, but instead advanced their queen. I asked the question, did you want to trade queens? And we did trade queens. Now, knight back to e3, I capture, they capture back, the opponent opening up the f-file for their rook. I ask whether or not they now want to trade bishops, and pretty much we're starting to running out of pieces here. Captures, captures, rooks look at each other. Rook captures rook, rook captures back on the f-file, opponent brings their other rook to the f-file, rooks looking at each other again. I think by this point we were both clearly thinking, let's trade all the pieces and have a endgame with just kings and pawns. However, I did note that I had two files with doubled pawns, which probably wasn't as good for me as for the opponent. So I, rather than capturing rook versus rook right away, I moved my rook to f6, giving me the opportunity to undouble one of my pawns. And that's what happened. And now we're in the odd situation of king with 8 pawns each. And in this position at the moment, we are perfectly equal. And you'll see big changes, and that largely just relates to, in terms of the sequence of moves, a perfect sequence of moves, which only a computer, I think, can see, whether or not one side or the other manages to promote first. Now, that's often not very obvious, at least not at my level, but obviously the computer can see it. So kings need to advance, kings need to take control. Now here I made a mistake. I should have moved my king forward, but I potentially thought, maybe it would be better for me to try to undouble my pawns. But of course, that leads to the opponent undoubling their pawns as well. But I feel that I've got more pawns advanced to the 5th rank, so I should technically be ahead. But Stockfish doesn't think so. King forward, and this shows how important having the king advance supporting the pawns are. I move another pawn forward, and this was a very good move by the opponent. It allows for infiltration of the king. Now, I didn't like that, so I moved my king to f7, preventing any further infiltration by the king. The opponent moves their d pawn forward, inviting a trade. And aiming for a pawn break. And here the opponent makes a critical error. So they captured with the e pawn, I think potentially thinking that they were keeping that chain of pawns alive. However, what this actually meant is that I have now a I now have my pawn on the e file that is open. So it's basically now a passed pawn, which is of a very substantial advantage to me, as you can see from that change in evaluation. I pushed that e pawn forward. The opponent sort of realizes the error, so starts to bring their king back. And here I make a blunder that I didn't see. So I thought that I had to bring my king back to prevent further infiltration of their king and also to protect both these pawns. However, it's actually unnecessary because if I move that pawn forward, the opponent cannot actually capture either of these pawns, because if they did so, this pawn will now promote. The king is not fast enough to prevent promotion. So if I move that pawn forward, the opponent king, is actually forced to retreat, and I didn't actually need to spend a king move. And as soon as I move the king forward, you can see the evaluation goes back to neutrality. So that single move brings us back to equality. So we're basically at a single move makes a difference between potentially winning and losing. The opponent moves another pawn forward, and obviously that pawn move is not the correct move, and so instantly the evaluation is back to benefiting me. I now make the correct move with the pawn, pushing the king back, and another move pushing the king back. And now I'm very happy because with these pawns, I have basically completely locked out these squares. So it is not possible for the king to infiltrate on this side of the board, which means I can potentially now move my king away from those pawns to this side of the board. So that was the wrong move. So I made an error move and again instantly dropped back to equality. The opponent also does a blunder, so moving their pawn to g4. So apparently the best move here is en passant. I didn't see that. I couldn't quite see how I could promote fast enough. Apparently there's a sequence there, but that's okay. I didn't see it. I moved my pawn back. And so here we see that was apparently a missed win, and we're basically almost back to equality. Opponent moves a pawn forward. I push forward my b pawn to stop the advance of those pawns. They move that forward. So that's the wrong move because it allows me to capture, and now this pawn is no longer protected by a neighboring pawn. And also, I don't think their king, whoops, not there, their king is fast enough to prevent me from capturing that pawn. And this king cannot break through on this part. And if the king tries to come over to this side of the board, it cannot prevent the advancement of these pawns potentially to promotion. So I was fairly confident now that that I was winning, and more importantly, it's sort of clear in a human logical way how I could win. So I moved my king over. The opponent now sort of sees the problem, cannot defend this pawn while preventing promotion from these pawns. So tries to come this way, but you know, these squares are protected. The pawn is protected. So they are really still blocked out on this side. I bring my king over. They try to go back. There, captures, and the opponent resigns. So now they are a pawn down, and it should be. No, I still have to potentially convert that if the opponent didn't resign to a win, and I still think it's not that simple. Lots of opportunity to make errors, but I think it's much easier for me to win this position now that I'm a pawn up. My pawns are more advanced forward. They're still together. These two groups of pawns are split, so I should win. But great game with the opponent for a short game. GG. I am the first to admit that I find king and pawn type endgames non-trivial. As can be seen in the evaluation bar, it can fluctuate wildly between winning, drawing, and losing. When there are many pawns and the position is balanced, one wrong move can mean that a perfect sequence, which relates to a count of many moves before a pawn can be promoted, can be lost. In this game, I won mostly as I blundered fewer times than my opponent in the endgame, but I could easily have lost this game. The insight from this game is that I need to brush up on my endgame technique. I hope you enjoyed the video and thanks for watching.